Good morning, and welcome to the live streaming of our Sunday morning Bible class. We are broadcasting from the Central Church in Martinsburg, West Virginia. We're so delighted that you have joined us for this broadcast, and we are very thankful to be able to be coming to you in this way. We have received so many notes and letters of encouragement. I just wanted to share with you two very quick ones, one from one of our own members and one from someone who is not a member of this particular congregation. The first says, "I am so blessed to be in a congregation with bold, godly leadership. I appreciate the men dreaming possible." I think that expresses the sentiments of many right now. They're so thankful for the fact that we have this technology and the ability to sort of stay connected and continue these Bible classes and sermons from God's Word. The other letter says, "We just wanted to thank you and the members at Central for making it possible for us to live stream your services. All of the lessons have been so good, and please tell the congregation how much we have enjoyed the singing. It has all made us feel a part of something bigger than what is going on now. Thank you for your efforts to continue God's work." So we appreciate those letters, and as I say, so many others and emails and whatnot that we've received. It's encouraging to us, and I hope that these lessons are encouraging to you. We are in a study of the book of Acts. In fact, this morning we're drawing this study to a close. We are in Acts chapter 27, near the very end of the book. You may want to, in your Bible, turn to Acts chapter 27. We'll be beginning at verse 13, where we left off last week. Just by way of very brief review, you remember at the beginning of this chapter, it is determined that Paul, having appealed to Caesar, will sail for Italy. And Luke includes himself in the number. He is the writer of the book. By the use of the word "we" there in verse 27, he includes himself. So Paul and Luke, and also there is an Aristarchus who is mentioned there in verse 2, one of the brothers. He is identified as a Macedonian of Thessalonica being with us. So they, along with this large company of prisoners, basically being transported at government expense to Rome because of the criminal justice system there. And a centurion who is identified as Julius of the Augustan band is in charge. He's in command of this group of prisoners. And of course, you have the ship's personnel, the crew of the ship, including apparently the owner of the ship and the captain and crew. All right, continuing now, we're seeing that they have dependent upon favorable winds, and this becomes an issue in these descriptions of their travel. Verse 13 of Acts 27 says, "And when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete close inshore. But after no long time there beat down from it a tempestuous wind, which is called Iraquilo. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven." So we're seeing a very accurate, detailed description of the trip, including the weather conditions, the wind, and so on, as well as the geographical description. And this is characteristic of the book of Acts, written by Luke. We have studied the first missionary journey of Paul, the map of which is on the screen before you, and the detailed description of that. And then the second missionary journey, which you can now see, which was larger, and again, how Luke described the various stops along the way, and then finally the third missionary journey. But now the map shows Paul's journey to Rome. And you can see there, as I'm using the pointer, beginning here down in Caesarea, how that voyage began, and then to Sidon, and then sailing across the Mediterranean Sea up here above Cyprus, and sailing westward. Of course, Italy being over here at the northwest corner of that map, and the city of Rome on the west coast there of Italy. That's their destination. So here they are. They're sailing westward, and we're going to be looking at these various stops that are pointed out along the way. Question 1 on your worksheet there, page 156 of your page, says, the centurion, owner, and master were assured in their decision by the soft blowing of the blank. Well, the verse says of the south wind. This gave them the confidence they thought they needed in order to begin the voyage. So number 2 says they weighed or heaved up or raised the anchor and sailed along blank. Well, that would be along Crete, close to the shore. How long did it take before they encountered blank? The word there, Iraquilo, literally means northeaster. That is a strong wind, and they encountered it, Luke says, in no long time. So they're just a short way into this long journey before this wind raises its ugly head, and they're dealing with a northeaster. Question 4, being caught by the heavy wind, they could not blank it. They couldn't face it. Picture the ship trying to sail into such a wind and depending upon sailing for its propulsion. So they what? Well, they gave way. The verse says they gave way or yielded to it and were driven. It's like acknowledging or admitting that they can't make the journey the way they had intended. They can't follow the course that they had intended, and so they have to give way to this strong wind. Verse 16, and running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were able with difficulty to secure the boat, and when they had hoisted it up, they used helps undergirding the ship, and fearing lest they should be cast upon the Syrtis, they lowered the gear and so were driven. So if you look at the map here, again, you can see the red line depicting their journey westward, and you see Myra and Rhodes and Cnidus on down southward here underneath of Crete, under the lee of Crete, as it's called. And on the map, you're going to see a number of cities or destination stops there, I guess, under the lee, which will be mentioned. Question 1, gaining some protection from the wind at the island of blank. Well, that would be the Isle of Cauda. They were finally able to what? The boat, to secure the boat. Now, the boat was usually tied or secured to the ship. It was a smaller vessel used for exiting the ship or transport purposes. They were able to secure the boat, which was towed then behind the ship, behind the vessel. Number 2, after hoisting up the boat, they used what? Well, they used helps. That means cables or ropes to undergird, to strengthen the ship. By passing these ropes or cables under the ship, you can picture how they could then draw those together and put tension on that in order to hold that ship together from being broken apart in the violent weather and the waves. Number 3, they lowered the what? The gear, which would be the sails. And when you want to be driven by the wind, you don't want those sails up there, or you're going to be just torn apart because the wind would catch those sails and destroy the ship. They lowered the sails or the rigging or the gear for fear of being cast upon the blank. The Syrtis, Syrtis, was a reference to that quicksand off of the northern coast of Africa. And that, here, if you notice on the map, we're not far from Africa here. This is Africa to the south. And the Syrtis was quicksand off of the coast. These sailors were afraid of that. It was well known about the danger of that, which posed a dreaded danger to ocean sailors of that day. Verse 18, and as we labored exceedingly with the storm, the next day they began to throw the freight overboard. And the third day they cast out with their own hands the tackling of the ship. And when neither sun nor stars shone upon us for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was now taken away. Middle of page 157 in your materials, question 1, true or false? The next day the storm began to subside. That's absolutely false. In fact, if anything, we see an intensification of the storm. What was the purpose in throwing some of the freight overboard? Verse 18, well, to lighten the ship, to prevent it taking on water. You can imagine a heavy vessel in large, increasing waves to take on water and eventually sink. So they would lighten the ship to raise it in its draft and prevent sinking. Number 3, on the blank day, they threw out the ship's what? Well, on the third day, he says they threw out the ship's tackling. That would be the furniture and equipment on board the ship. So you can see the level of desperation increasing here and trying to basically just save their own lives. Question 4, why did their inability to see the sun and stars create such a disheartening situation? Well, remember, that was their means of navigation. They didn't have GPS and computer technology in those days. They were expert in navigation, but they depended heavily upon seeing the stars and the sun, neither of which was possible under these conditions. Verse 21, and when they had been long without food, then Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, ye should have hearkened unto me, and not have set sail from Crete, and have gotten this injury and loss. And now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of the God whose I am, whom also I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, thou must stand before Caesar. And lo, God hath granted thee all them that sail with thee. Verse 25, Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God, that it shall be even so as it hath been spoken unto me. But we must be cast upon a certain island. All right, very important verses there, and this message to Paul, which he transmits to them. True or false? Paul told the others that they should have listened to him when he advised against sailing for Phoenix. That's true. I think we can see in Paul's demeanor and his manner, this is not a I told you so situation. He's not saying it for his own benefit, nor to increase his own worth or pride here. But he is explaining to them the danger that they've gotten themselves into and why, and what they must do going forward. Number 2 says, does Paul claim that his new prediction is of God? Yes. Here he specifically says that God gave him the message. He transmitted the message to him. In fact, he says, there stood by me this night an angel of the God whose I am. So he's specifically claiming that this message comes from God. What's the gist of it? The gist of the revelation is that he and the other sailors would be spared. Their lives would be spared. The ship itself would be lost. And he does also mention that they would have to be cast upon a certain island. So there's a lot in that, the way he phrases that, as will come to light here shortly. And that takes us to Acts 27, verse 27. But when the 14th night was come, as we were driven to and fro in the Sea of Adria, about midnight the sailors surmised that they were drawing near to some country. And they sounded, and found 20 fathoms. And after a little space they sounded again, and found 15 fathoms. And fearing lest haply we should be cast ashore on rocky ground, they let go 4 anchors from the stern and wished for the day. We notice here that the Sea of Adria is that portion of the Mediterranean Sea lying between Achaia, Africa, and Italy. Notice again on the map, Here you have their route of travel westward, following the red line. This is Africa to the south, Achaia up here to the northeast, and Italy, of course, over here to the northwest. So they know that they're in that huge area somewhere, uncertain of where they are. On the 14th night at about blank, the sailors concluded that they were approaching land. Well, it was about midnight, Luke says. Why do you suppose that they believed this? That's a question that some people have asked in reading these verses. Again, modern sailing is a much different experience, much different venture than it was then. But these seafaring men and experienced sailors could probably discern, even in the darkness and in the waves and that condition, that they were approaching land by the difference in sound and the echoes and the sensations that they felt as they were passing through the sea. We're not told exactly how, but probably their sailing experience caused them to sense that something was near, possibly the sound. Their first sounding, which is a depth measurement where they would take a measurement of the depth of the water, usually involved lowering a weight of some kind into the water. And with great experience, and that sounds easy, but it takes a lot of skill to do that and get a reading. That first sounding measured how many fathoms? Well, the text says 20 fathoms. A fathom is about 6 feet, so you're looking at, what's that, 120 feet in depth for the water where they were. But their second sounding, which occurred a short while later, revealed only 15 fathoms. So that indicates that they were nearing a coast of some kind, and they knew that. They were getting close to land. So what did they fear? Well, they feared striking ground. And if you strike ground in a ship of that nature, you could get stuck and torn apart. So they let go 4 anchors, the verse says, 4 anchors to try to hold their position from the stern or rear of the ship, and they what? They wished for the day. I wonder if any of you have ever wished for the day. Well, they certainly were in that position. Verse 30, and as the sailors were seeking to flee out of the ship and had lowered the boat into the sea, under color as though they would lay out anchors from the foreship, Paul said to the centurion, to the soldiers, except these abide in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the boat and let her fall off. So, question, describe how the sailors attempted to trick the others. Well, they were pretending, it says under color, that is, under the pretense that they were going to put out anchors from the foreship. They were lowering the boat. What they were going to do was escape and get away themselves and leave those on the boat to worry about themselves. Who thwarted their plan and how? Well, it was the Apostle Paul. And he thwarted it by telling the centurion and the soldiers that this must stop. These sailors must stay with the ship. And if they didn't stay together, that these soldiers would be lost. If they don't stay with the ship, he says, you cannot be saved. Was Paul's warning here, verse 31, required by the message he received from God? I would say that it was. Remember, he had received that message from God, and I said that was very important to look at the wording of that message. Since he has been given an assurance of safety, why did Paul bother to stop this plot of the sailors? Well, the assurance of safety that he had been given was conditional, wasn't it? Safety was promised to those who would sail with him. It was not just a blanket, unconditional promise. And so there's an important lesson here. When God gives us promises or assurances in his word, but those promises and assurances depend upon our action, our faithfulness, our obedience, for example, then those stipulations become conditions. God doesn't just lay out blanket promises and say, I'm going to do this for you regardless of what you do. Typically, there are conditions attached. And that is the way we see God operating here. And Paul understood that. And he said, these have to stay with the ship, or you cannot be saved. So how did the soldiers effectively stop the plot of these sailors? Well, they simply cut the ropes and let that boat fall off. That would put an end to that plan. Verse 33, and while the day was coming on, Paul besought them all to take some food, saying, this day is the 14th day that you wait and continue fasting, having taken nothing. Wherefore I beseech you to take some food, for this is for your safety. For there shall not a hair perish from the head of any of you. And when he had said this and had taken bread, he gave thanks to God in the presence of all. And he brake it and began to eat. Then were they all of good cheer, and themselves also took food. And we were in all in the ship 260 souls. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. True or false question here at the bottom of page 158. By now, Paul seems to command the respect of the others on board. Well, that's true. You can see it very clearly in the reading. And in fact, we saw an evolution of respect toward Paul almost from the beginning. Really the second day. By the second day, if you go back and look at the earlier verses in chapter 27, it seems that the centurion was already looking at Paul in a very respectful way. So, how did he achieve that respect? Well, by constantly looking to God, pointing them to God, setting an example that was consistent with what he was saying, a Christian example. Good lessons for us today, folks. If you want respect, even from people of the world, be consistent with your Christian principles. Number 2, describe the general mood of the ship's personnel and how any change in their mood had come about. Well, the words are good cheer. They were of good cheer. They had eaten. You know, you always feel better after you eat, at least if you don't eat too much, like some of you that I could mention. But you have to be careful what you eat, but you always feel better after eating, and their mood improved because Paul has given them some assurances and says, I believe God's assurances. Verse 39, and when it was day, they knew not the land, but they perceived a certain bay with a beach, and they took counsel whether they could drive the ship upon it. And casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea, at the same time loosing the bands of the rudders, and hoisting up the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But lighting upon a place where two seas met, they ran the vessel aground. And the foreship struck and remained unmovable, but the stern began to break up by the violence of the waves. All right, question 1. At daybreak, what were they able to observe? A certain bay, he says, with a beach. Now think of that. Think of the safety that came to their mind as they thought about the possibility of actually making land. Not against some big rocky cliff or crag somewhere where they would be killed and destroyed with the ship, but actually being able to get to a safe beach. Then they discussed among themselves the possibility of doing what? Of actually driving the ship onto the beach. What would be the purpose for that maneuver? Well, so they could get to the shore, so they could get off of the ship safely somehow overboard and get to the shore and avoid drowning. And so question 3 says, deciding to try it, identify what they did. Well, if you look at that list of things there, it's the middle of page 159. The first thing they did was they cast off the anchors. Remember, they had dropped 4 anchors off the stern of the ship. They cast them off and left them in the sea. What would that do? It would allow the ship to be free, to be driven. Number 2 would be they loosed or untied the bands of the rudders. Now, the rudders were the steering devices which had been secured so that untying them would allow them to be used in trying to steer the vessel under those conditions. Number 3, they raised the front sail into the wind. What would that do? That would take that ship quickly, fast toward the coast, toward the beach. And number 4, of course, they made for the beach. They headed for the beach. Question 4. Identify those events which happened next. Well, they reached a point where 2 seas or huge waves met. Yes, that would certainly be true. The front of the ship ran aground and held firm. Yes, that's specifically mentioned as well. The ship owner cried out, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." No, that was another chapter. The rear of the ship was torn apart by the waves. Yes. So those are the 3 things that happened next in their maneuvering. Verse 42, and the soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim out and escape. But the centurion, desiring to save Paul, stayed them from their purpose and commanded that they who could swim should cast themselves overboard and get first to the land, and the rest, some on planks and some on other things from the ship. And so it came to pass that they all escaped safe to the land. Question 1. In the face of such a situation, what was the soldiers' idea and why? Well, the soldiers' idea was to kill the prisoners, Luke says, so that they wouldn't escape. Makes sense, if you're responsible for the security of those prisoners. But why was that plan not carried out? Well, the centurion wanted to save Paul. That's very significant, how he had gained the respect and admiration of the Apostle Paul. What plan was used instead? He commanded that everyone should jump overboard, swim to the shore on a plank or whatever you can gather from the ship, and that's what they did. True or false? As a result, all of the ship's personnel survived with the exception of the 4 anchormen. No, that's false. They all survived, the text says, so it came to pass that they all escaped safe to the land. Are there any questions on chapter 27? Well, hearing none, we're going to go into chapter 28. Verse 1, and when we were escaped, then we knew that the island was called Melita, and the barbarians showed us no common kindness, for they kindled a fire and received us all because of the present rain and because of the cold. Now look at your map there. You see the red line where they've been sailing with difficulty, and you have the island here of what is now called Malta, but at that time known as Melita. And so here's where we are, just south of Sicily and Italy, as shown on the map. Note, the term barbarian, I'm sorry, I missed one. Question 1 there, escaping to the shore, they learned that the island was called what? Well, it's Melita, of course, like it just said, now called Malta. How did they come to know that? Well, probably because the islanders told them. Here they are cast ashore on this island, and there are individuals, persons there. Notice that the term barbarian, which is used here, and it was used by the Romans to refer to those other than themselves. It did not carry the insulting meaning that it sometimes does today. Today, if you call somebody a barbarian, that's not a high compliment. But those Romans typically would use that terminology to refer to others. How does Luke describe the barbarians' hospitality? He says they showed us no common kindness. That is, they were very courteous, very kind to them, and surely it was appreciated at this point. In their kindness, the barbarians built a what? A fire. why would this fire, which must have been very large to accommodate everyone, remember the number of people on the ship that we just studied? There's a lot of men here. Why would that be especially welcome by these travelers? Well, remember, they're soaking wet. They're drenched from having swam ashore from the ship. And it's raining, according to verse 2. So they are cold, and surely that fire, a nice, huge, large bonfire that they could sort of crowd around, felt good and was very, very welcome. Verse 3. But when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out by reason of the heat and fastened on his hand. And when the barbarians saw the venomous creature hanging from his hand, they said one to another, "No doubt this man is a murderer, whom, though he hath escaped from the sea, yet justice hath not suffered to live. Howbeit he shook off the creature into the fire and took no harm. But they expected that he would have swollen or fallen down dead suddenly. But when they were long in expectation and beheld nothing amiss came to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god." Question 1, which occurred as Paul helped gather wood for the fire? Well, the right answer is a viper or a poisonous snake attached to his hand. By the way, if you've ever been bitten by a snake, you know that that's no pleasant experience either. And even a non-venomous snake can have very, very painful bite. But a viper, or poisonous snake, these islanders knew this was a very grave, serious situation. And so it says that they attributed this to justice with a capital J there in verse 4. Justice was the name given to a Greek goddess, worshipped as the guardian of justice. Why did these barbarians conclude that Paul was a murderer? Was it because of the snake bite alone? Well, certainly that contributed to it, but remember, he had just narrowly escaped a devastating shipwreck. And in their superstition, they're thinking, man, this guy, he's really got the cards stacked against him, as we would say, and must be something really wrong with him. Maybe one of the prisoners, or even one of perhaps the centurion himself, had told somebody that these were prisoners, maybe a criminal, or maybe they'd gotten the idea that because they were prisoners. But sort of a combination of those things, no doubt, led them to really doubt Paul at this point. True or false, with great difficulty, Paul shook the snake loose into the fire and eventually recovered from the effects of the poison. Well, that's false. There's no difficulty involved. This is apparently a miraculous intervention by God that completely healed him or prevented him from being stricken by this venom of the snake. What was the effect upon the barbarians of witnessing this miracle? Well, they changed their minds quickly, didn't they? They concluded that now that Paul was a god. You might want to compare this situation to the situation back in Lystra that we studied back in chapter 14. You remember there, they first took Paul for a god, but later they were stoning him. Here, it's the other way around, isn't it? They were at first doubtful, skeptical, thinking he was a murderer, and now here they are thinking that he is a god. In verses 7 through 10, Paul is entertained by Publius. Verse 7 says, "Now in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the chief man of the island named Publius, who received us and entertained us 3 days courteously." So the question says, property in that neighborhood was owned by the blank. That would be the chief man of the island named Publius. Even in today's culture, in many places, it's not uncommon to find chiefs. a prominent citizen who basically has the respect and the authority. And if he is a Roman, which is possible, and given his name, maybe even likely, he may have had some actual official authority as well. Identify those things which Publius did. Well, he received Paul and his party, yes. He entertained them for 3 days, yes. And by the way, that's a pretty significant feat too. Again, look at the size of the number of people involved. Must have been a fairly wealthy man to provide for them for 3 days. And he exercised courtesy, yes. Verse 8, and it was so that the father of Publius lay sick of fever and dysentery, unto whom Paul entered in and prayed, and laying his hands on him, healed him. And when this was done, the rest also that had diseases in the island came and were cured, who also honored us with many honors, and when we sailed, they put on board such things as we needed. Question 1, Luke here describes the healing of the blank of Publius, the father. And he was sick with a fever and dysentery. That's what the wording that Luke uses there. What did the other barbarians who had diseases do? Were cured? Yes. Remained ignorant of Jesus, knowing only of Paul? No. As we see in Paul's conduct here and in the verses following, Paul was constantly teaching. He was not ashamed to say who he was, how he was following God. He was a servant of God and of Jesus Christ. Honored Paul's party with many honors, that should say, honors, yes. And equipped the ship when they were to sail again, yes. So you have 3 out of 4 there before the voyage is resumed, beginning at verse 11. Acts 28, verse 11. And after 3 months we set sail in a ship of Alexandria, which had wintered in the island, whose sign was the twin brothers. During those 3 months, what do you think Paul was doing? 3 months, no doubt, preaching the gospel, teaching the gospel, and having an influence upon those around him. So how long did Paul's party winter on the island of Melita? 3 months. Question 2, then they sailed in a ship of blank. The answer is a ship of Alexandria, whose sign or name was the twin brothers. Today, it's still customary to name ships, and they did that in those days. We are told that the twin brothers likely refers to Castor or Pollux, the 2 sons of Jupiter, who were said by the Greeks to be special guardians of sailors. That's interesting. Verse 12, and touching at Syracuse, we tarried there 3 days, and from thence we made a circuit, and arrived at Rhegium. And after 1 day a south wind sprang up, and on the 2nd day we came to Puteoli, where we found brethren, and were entreated to tarry with them 7 days, and so we came to Rome. And from thence the brethren, when they had heard of us, came to meet us as far as the Market of Appius and the 3 taverns, whom when Paul saw, he thanked God and took courage. So the question says, number in order the points of travel, omitting any which do not belong. And here's where you might want to look at the map, because it's very clearly laid out on the map as they're traveling northward right up to Rome here. You see, first of all, is Syracuse, right down there in the southeastern corner. Number 2, Rhegium. Number 3 is Puteoli, and there the text says they found brethren. They found members of the church and tarried there 7 days. Number 4, the Market of Appius, which incidentally is a town on the Appian Way. The Appian Way was a paved street. There they saw brethren and thanked God, and they took courage. And then number 5 would be the 3 taverns. That's a village only 35 miles from Rome. where again they saw brethren, they saw members of the church, and thank God, and they took courage. Why did Paul remain at Puteoli 7 days? I hope all of you know the answer to that, and you are sitting at home behind your computer right now saying the correct answer, because we have seen this now at least 2 prior times in the book of Acts. Those of you who have been following the study closely, I'm sure you know the answer. You probably knew it before. That when Paul found brethren, he found members of the church, it was not uncommon for him to stay long enough to meet with the brethren on the Lord's Day and observe the Lord's Supper with them. It's just one more indication that they were in the habit of regularly meeting on the Lord's Day and partaking of the Lord's Supper together. Verse 16. I'm sorry, I think I missed a question. There's a second part to that question. Why did Julius the centurion permit it? That is, why did he permit Paul to remain there 7 days? Think about it. He's responsible for getting these prisoners to Rome, and he lets Paul stay there, delays his trip for a whole week. Why would he permit that? Does that not show a great degree of respect that by now he had for the Apostle Paul? It was basically at Paul's disposal. Paul is the prisoner, that's true. He's in custody, but Paul is an honorable man, and by now has gained great influence with this centurion. Now, verse 16, and when we entered into Rome, Paul was suffered to abide by himself with the soldier that guarded him. Question 1, this is on page 162. Arriving at blank, Rome, Paul was suffered or permitted to stay by himself with the soldier that guarded him. Now notice that. This is what is typically called Paul's house arrest. It was exceptional to allow a prisoner that kind of liberty and freedom to remain in his own quarters, if you will, with only the soldier. Now the soldier would have been chained to Paul and would have been changed frequently. I think about every 3 hours those Romans would change that soldier. So Paul has a Roman soldier chained to him around the clock and guarding him, but basically he's free to entertain guests, to refresh himself, sort of like what we would call house arrest or a home detention situation. What accounts for this unusual courtesy? Well, again, Paul's actions were responsible for this safe journey that they've obtained, the arrival of all of them by following what Paul said to do, which I'm sure by now was greatly appreciated by the centurion. All right, we're almost out of time. I'm going to stop there at chapter 28. Week we will finish the book and we will begin our study of the book of Romans. I want you please to be reading the book of Romans very carefully. It's 16 chapters, and I want to say this: if you get Romans, God gets you. The book of Romans is a tremendous and exciting book. It is very deep in places, and it'll be a fascinating study if you really apply yourself, and I look forward to studying the book of Romans with you. But next week, Lord willing, we will finish the marvelous book of Acts. I do want to mention that the Acts Riddle, which you received, that appears at the end of the material there, the Acts Riddle, we had several who answered that correctly, and what I've decided to do is award both a male and a female award. And they came in on the very day that we taught this class last week on Sunday. At 5:02 p.m., John gave me the right answer, and at 9:56, Mary gave me the right answer John and Mary, two very biblical names who both got it right. And we will discuss, Lord willing, your gift next week. Thank you for joining in our class today and for your interest in this amazing study of the book of Acts. And we appreciate your time together. Please stay tuned. Shortly we'll begin our worship service together at 10:45 Eastern Standard Time here from the Central Church of Christ. God bless you and thanks for joining our study today.